some seconds for more attendees for this discussion. Let me provide you my introduction. Welcome to the fourth episode of Looking for a Center in Colombia. This time, we have the honor of talking with Juanita Goebertus, who's had several important positions in the government of Colombia. Today, she's a congresswoman of the Green Party. Now allow me to speak, to provide some instructions. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the fourth episode of Looking for the Center of Colombia. Today, we're very honored to have Juanita Goebertus with us, who's had very high roles in the Colombian government, particularly in the peace process. And now she's a congresswoman from Bogota for the party. If you want to listen to this episode, this will be in Spanish. If you wanted to listen to it with the interpretation in English, please choose the icon at the bottom that says interpretation, and you can enjoy it in English with Gloria Mejia's skills. So thank you for that. So thank you for being with us again. Let's begin with, before we begin this episode, let me mention some things. We will have another episode in about 2 weeks, and we're about to announce it, but I want to confirm some dates still. But if you want to know about this, you can consult our website, ccacanada.com. And also on the 27th of April, we'll have our gala, our annual gala, in honor of Wade Davis, anthropologist, and Session Shar, another honoree of the asset management. He is the chief for this company in the world. Julian Ted will be the moderator of this discussion between, and she's from the Financial Times in London. And she writes a lot on her column. And she also works with Moral Money. And we're confirming the participation of former President Juan Manuel Santos as well. And we'll be about to confirm this. This is 26th of April. It's free. It will begin at 11 a.m. time Colombia, at noon Eastern time in the States. You can pre-register, but still, for you to know, it's free. So this, we should begin now our discussion with Juanita. Welcome, Juanita. What a pleasure to have you with us. And we're always with Sandra Borda as well, our co-moderator and author, professor of Los Andes University, a very well-known woman in Colombia and outside of Colombia because of her ideas and her comments about politics in Colombia and outside Colombia internationally as well. So Sandra, welcome. Hello. Hello, Ken, and welcome to everybody that's joining us today. And of course, Juanita, thank you for giving us a yes to this invitation that we made to several of the leaders and the people that have participated and have been main characters in this discussion on the center and the entire political process that has to do with this. So let me ask you the same question I've asked all of these guests. Let's say, I think that everybody can say that the center, the political center of Colombia, is relatively new. It's a result of the expansion of the political continuum and ideology in Colombia. I would say that until the end of the armed conflict, it was more center right. And now, as it has expanded, there's more space for the development of the ideas of the center. So let me ask you two things, Juanita. How would you build a synthesis of what you're beginning to do with these early ideas. And with that, with all political and ideological discussions, you compare yourself with others, of course. So how would you define your ideas compared to the others of this ideology? And my second question is, in that setting of this center, what is the role of the Green Party, your party? What do you provide? What's your competitive edge in the Green Party in this setting, this early center? Andrea Ken, thank you so much for your invitation, but especially for making this webinar to try to define the center. As Sandra says, I know that this process is relatively new, and trying to define it is a big challenge. So again, thank you for this setting beyond my participation. The idea is to consolidate this vision. So let me begin with these two questions. In the Coalition of Hope, which is part of the alternatives of the center that the center is trying to determine, we are creating a committee in which all of the pre-candidates have a representative, and I'm part of the Green Party. And we've been trying to build ideas, both of how to govern, meaning what ethical principles would guide our good governance, what joins us among us as pre-candidates. And the other part is that ideologically, what guides our vision, what is a good public policy. So let me begin with the first item because it's important. It also helps to counteract the alternatives. First, this coalition is a collective effort. It's a group of people. It has had a political background that's vast. Kent said, yes, this center is more male, 50-year on, but we have women. We have Ana Maria Robledo, and we have other women. We want a woman like Francia Marquez, who has had differences with the history, but the idea is to have her more in this alternative. We're saying if it's possible, we've got people like Cecilia Lopez, who we've talked with. So there's a way of expanding this setting. But remember, this is a collective. This is not a landlords or anything like that, or warlords. No, everybody says that Fajardo would win, but we have Humberto de la Calle and Galan as well. These are people that have people that follow them as well. There's no messiah, really. For me, there's an important element that we have to do, and it's to try to recover our trust in politics. Because when we're in the left, we're in the right for too long, and the idea is to be in the center where everything is transparent, in which everybody can trust. That's our first stepping point. But we have to keep in mind that the people are sick of politics. They don't trust in it. They don't believe in those categories because they think that the bottom line is that politicians cave in, give in, and that in that sense, there's no connection between politicians and the people. Some are independent, more towards the left. We've got people with the liberals, and we have people like Juan Manuel Galan and Humberto Lacalle, but they have said sometimes that there are ethical principles that won't be committed. So there's an important axis of trying to make a policy that's transparent, not clientele, not based on transactions and red tape, so that we can recover the trust. We see a lot of white men, yes, in the center, but if we look at their origin, we have people from Boyacá, from Santander, from Antioquia, from Nariño, from Cesar, from Santander. So we have to help show not where they come from, but also their focus in the different regions. So it's not only focused on Bogota. We have a group of people that really believe in democracy. I mean, they are institutionalized. They don't believe in authoritarianism. They don't have populist visions, that they are the leader, that and that they have the last word no matter what, especially believing that everything has to be transparent. They are self-critical and they say, okay, I have to go follow ethics and the legal parts of everything. And I think that's very important in a time that globally we see threats to democracy because of the populist leaders that say it's me, I'm the important one, and that's it. We also have people in our collective that can that have special stances when it comes to the false positives committed by the state or coexistence with paramilitarism, but they've been there to not justify in any way armed conflicts. When you analyze several of the talks of the leaders of the right or the left, you can find justifications for this. So the idea is to heal and to acknowledge the different violences, but not just justify any, nor to say that one of these violences was a right. It could be there. It could be there. That's what we believe. Also, these people of our collective like to talk. They are good listeners. I do think that this phenomenon of the polarization of Colombia has made it more difficult to acknowledge something good from the left or the right and vice versa, and to look at the merits of the people, to look at people. So there are really elements of characterization of how I think that these people make their politics. So with that said, let me move to the second question. What's the vision of public policy do they have? And based on that, which are the priorities for those that exercise the next as the next president? So within this continuum that has so many gray parts, it's not white and black. There's no left, center, and right. There's a lot of gray areas in between. You can find a vision of economic policy of the right that has the understanding that the economy alone, without regulation, can alone create wealth and to distribute it without a significant role of the state. On the left, however, it's more for the state that intervenes in everything and it can create not only wealth, but its distribution. So it's more focused on distribution than creating the wealth, while the right creates more wealth than distribution. Typically, in the center left, center right, what they seek is to say, we need a market, a capitalist that allows the economic growth through innovation, productivity to create more wealth. So there's a big consensus. Not we don't create as a country enough wealth. And the second item is that we have a tax system that's absurd, which leaves us equal in terms of redistribution post tax. So it's the same thing compared not to pay taxes because we're the ones that redistribute less after taxes. So the logic is to create more wealth, but to be serious and to be taxing more to wealth, especially the individuals in Colombia. There's a huge space to tax more individuals, dividends, and to really see that those resources are redistributed to close the gap of poverty. So in very general terms, it makes us find a combination between the market to create wealth and the state to guarantee the redistribution. So the same things happens with freedoms or rights. We have a typical vision of the rights. We had a big discussion on this last week in the media. A representative of the Centro Democrático said, look, when it comes to gender, these quota are finishing and the percentages parity are finishing the national unit. So they understand that society alone shouldn't be making the cultural transformation processes and no intermission of the state, quote unquote. This was with regards to the chance of having more women participating in politics, to have more female representatives, especially in the higher courts, where you can see very few women than on the base of the pyramid, where there's a lot of women that through merit are representing 62% of the courts, and in the high courts, it's the worst. It's less than 10%. So here we see a vision of the right. Don't intervene, do it alone, so there's no participation in cultural transformations. If we look at the left's vision, they say, no, we have to make a series of guarantees, of corrections, of participations, in which we have quotas, in which have the chance of have the rules of parity and participation. In that axis, our coalition is more towards the left. It's recognizing that we do need those corrections of this equality or inequalities, and that it's through quotas that we can promote more equality and more participation of women. So those are two examples, two extremes, and that helps you to show where the center or center left stands. So with that, and to finish this long answer, we believe in the center that the emphasis, because we're coming from a crisis, a historical crisis. Colombia was going through a slow process, but it started to reduce poverty. It started to improve education and healthcare. But with the pandemic, we set back at least 10 years when it comes to poverty levels. So it shows that what we really have to do from hereafter is to emphasize is the creation of jobs and to reduce poverty. And when that needs a redistributive system that's much more serious, a tax reform that will aim towards making serious taxes towards individuals. And also we have a degradation of safety. In the past government, through the peace process, we started to see the consolidation of peace in the territory. And with this government, we see a degradation. So now we have an increase of 165% of massacres, 99% in murders of leaders. So we have many destabilization manifestations in different territories or regions of Colombia. So we need more safety to protect lives and implementing the peace process. And we need process of the state throughout the country, way beyond the will that this government expressed with a no, and then depending the implementation of the peace process. But there's very little development of it seen so far. And the third priority, which relates to acknowledging that we are the second most biodiverse country in the world. The pandemic stopped or halted our capacity, or the world's capacity, not only in productivity and social interaction. And what it's saying, the world, what's the best way of preventing this pandemic? It's with using biodiversity, and Colombia sits on a mine of biodiversity, but it has to know how to protect it. So it's got to assume its appraisal of what public policies it's going to choose, knowing that's sitting on this mine of biodiversity. We see only 36% of budgets are headed towards the Amazon and rivers and riverbanks. So we really have to sit down to have a development plan to create a biodiversity protection plan. Otherwise, we won't be able to have something as to a competitive edge, but we won't be able to face existential dilemmas like we've had to with this pandemic. I'm sorry about this long answer, but I really wanted to underscore what we believe in. Oh, there's something, Sandra. And what's the role of the Green Party? We're like we like to build things. We are the only our pre-candidates are the only ones that have legal operational status. You know that we are trying to recover. There are others that are trying to recover this status to see if they can access this status. So this means that we still have some alternatives. One is, and we said it publicly on Friday before the Holy Week, we made the decision to open the chance that those in the coalition of hope to be part of the Green Party have the doors open. So this is not only a coalition for being a president, but also to enhance the party with people from different sectors, people from the left, like Angela Maria, like Jorge Enrique Robledo, for others from the center right, like Juan Manuel Galan. So, and to make the party more robust, but also there's a chance that if these pre-candidates can access another status through these paths, or they want to access another one, we can have a coalition in which the party would still have its group of leaders, as always, robusted or supported by the others, but no direct access of these others. So this has helped to create a platform. It's been confusing. People say, hey, you go out and fight. Speaker says something, the other says others. It's hard. I'm new in these electoral politics, but I believe that a good democracy has to have a process based on enhancing their parties. The Green Party does not have a leader per se that's whipping us saying what to do. We've got different factions, but step by step, we're making decisions, and it's to have the coalition of hope, guarantee that those that want to be part of our group can do so, to robust our list of coalitions, or with the entrance of these peoples. It's not always easy to create a party, but it's been a good experience. Following up your first part of the answer, and to deepen more in the discussion on the nature of the coalition per se, I was wondering, the Green Party and also Compromiso Ciudadano has emphasized a track is public policy and specific policies, and the other is how to make policy, how to do policy, to be more ethical, and how in campaigns you can show what's going to happen when you're in the government, and the importance of the rules of the game and the principles when you exercise politics. This is a recurrent topic both in the Green Party and in Compromiso Ciudadano, and for what you've said, which is very important for the coalition. So I wonder, keeping that in mind, how do you keep a balance? Or how do you reduce the tension between that specific need that's so big to inject more principles and ethics in politics in Colombia, and in the other side is the eligibility? Because some people can suggest, and I think so, but it's a discussion totally open. So much purism can hurt the political chances that people have. This means, let me give you a specific question. By expanding the coalition toward sectors that probably have been questioned, I'm not talking necessarily about for corruption purposes. It could be clientelism, it could be doing lobby. But I wonder, how can you, or what do you think about people like Vargas, who eventually are more traditional politicians, coming from traditional parties
or they are traditional. Would they also have a space in your coalition? I mean, what's the criteria? So, meaning, how do you translate that commitment to those particular principles with the expansion of the coalition and consequently expanding the possibilities of winning the next elections? Sandra, I share your concern and that tension that we have there always. A first step has been taken with that lesson. Frankly, within the coalition of hope, we saw that there was that in 2018 to see Huberto Lacalle and Fajardo couldn't get together was absurd. And it got to the point that the difference between Petro and Fajardo were 267 votes, and the Lacalle got almost 400,000 votes. So, of course, it's more complex than adding votes, but the chance of that formula going to the second round would have been higher. And also, all surveys shown, the last one made by Semana shows that the chances that who will win the second with the second round, somebody in the center could be Fajardo and De La Calle, much more than the right or the left. So the results of that second turn, the margin of Pedro is 9 percentage points over the right, then compared to that of Fajardo is of 25 in average. So it does look that there's a big chance there. So I share because being intransigent is not only because of the chance of winning, but also to be governed by somebody like Ivan Duque, who lacks capacity to lead in a crucial time of history in Colombia. So there is something I'd like to acknowledge that we were intransigent. Sergio Fajardo and everybody in the green would not have been able in 2018 to expand the coalition, including Juan Manuel Galan, Humberto Lacalle, and Cristo. But today we can, with some agreements of principles. So we're going to have a transparent policy based on recovering trust from the people. And going back to your point, not only how we evolved compared to 2018, but how can we expand from here after? This is still to be discussed, but I think that ahead, the coalition that we will have to govern, sure, we'll have to include the Liberal Party. So we will have to need it to have discussions with the programmatic agreement compared to that of the Liberal. There are very, very valuable sectors of the Liberal Party. I work with them, for instance, in Valle, in euthanasia, different uses of cannabis, very valuable people in the Liberal Party with liberal principles with which we could have in a public policy or agenda. Or people in the rural area like Harry Rosales and Caqueta, a politician of the Liberal Party, and he wants to build peace. There are differences with them, yes, but there are rural development plans that we can talk with them. So the question is very difficult to answer because it's where you draw the line. But I'm convinced that if we're more pragmatic and if we accept what's at stake, we have the chance not only to make agreements, not based on red tape or making a treason of public politics, but based on agreements that those that are part of our coalition can have a decision making process there. Let me give you an example. The entrance of the Liberal Party to the national government with the Santos, with the law of victims. That was a good exchange based on public policy. A poor example that I lived with the Santos government firsthand was the discussion of the legal framework of peace and to end up discussion which provides the consolidation agency to implement everything. So it's a dog that bites its own tail. It looks at all different transactions
and then it ends not having the capability because I gave it to another agency. So we have to be clear, not only do we lose trust, but to be effective in public policies if we have red tape involved. But if the agreement is based on deciding two priorities, I believe that that's the type of coalitions that we must create. Of course, we have to guarantee what we are. You mentioned Bargalleras. We represent very different things. Bargalleras and the coalition of governors is part really of the traditional politicians. And I think in 2018, really, they said, I mean, the people said no more. I think that Bargalleras would have been a better president and would be more capable of being a president than Duque. Yes, of course. But the idea is not to have interest, personal interests. So the people don't believe this. Going back to your original question, if the center is new, I believe that traditional parties focused on transactions have been more centered because we don't have radicalism there. Radicalism is more in Centro Democrático, this wave, and in the origin, it was anti-politics, obviously full of internal policies, but that was basically, and also other movements towards the left. And they say that they're more anti-politics. The problem is that the center that we had before had bureaucratic transactions. It stopped meaning something for ideals. Everybody saw politicians better off in what they wanted for themselves. Our challenge is to guarantee transparency to recover the citizens' trust, to guarantee that our politics is not for exchanges, but good public policies with the capability to have public policies with other sectors when there are chances to do that. Thank you, Juanita. Recently, we've heard many cases. We know which ones I'm talking about, really, about reforming the justice system in Colombia. Colombia is losing its institutionality within the sector. Uh, I'd like to talk about the principles of the coalition. Will we see on April 22nd, will we see something about the justice system in Colombia? April 22nd will be, in which we'll be launching the center. We will be talking about three things. What joins us? Why is it a collective effort and what we represent? Then the ethics and our principles and how we commit to our campaign. And then programmatic principles. And there indeed, we will refer to the need of making a justice reform. But it's important to point out, and that's something we're working on, that we'll only have programmatic principles. So most of the development of programs is something that we still have to work on throughout this year. Overall, there is a consensus that justice must be reformed. Recent reforms have focused only on the top of justice, how to distribute the government and managing the branches, but it has nothing to do with the commoners that want more access to justice. And we think that that's something that's much more of a priority. But really, the big problem that we've seen in my case, because I work in peace and rurality, is that in these 170 municipalities, more than 80% don't have police homicides. And in many cases, we don't know really who are those responsible of killing the leaders because we don't have judicial capacity to investigate these cases. 80% of these cases don't have the Fiscalia to work on the investigations of these murders.
to look at the organized crime, they're miles away. So it's almost impossible for justice to be serving the citizen. So the bulk, the idea is that we will have an idea of our principles, and we will be talking about justice and management of justice. But I do share that most of what's happening, and we saw it last week with the decision to charge Sergio Fajardo, but many others, what we start to see the risk is the people's trust will degrade. And that's serious for society because tomorrow anybody can question any decision. And that creates a risk of not having an arbitrator that will say, this is the person that's right or not. But when you start to see that level of politicization of justice, but especially when there's no access to local justice management, people think that they can solve conflicts on their own or not reporting anything. We have documented, we really don't know what's the problem. Insecurity in many regions because people say people are not reporting any more deaths or murders because of the brutal problem of not being certain of what's happening in many regions. So yes, undoubtedly there's a consensus. The three candidates in the group to reform justice mainly focused on expanded capacity to manage justice locally, especially where the justice has been poorly represented. I wonder, Juanita, if the justice reform and the other part, which seems to interest others, which is the political reform. And 2 weeks ago, Krista talked about this. What type of approach do you have in the coalition for for you? What's most important? Krista said that for the political reform, he has no problem to get into a constitutional reform. And that's not a bad idea because it suggests that the chances of making a reform in the past have not progressed because simply Congress seems that it's very to be very vulnerable to the pressures from the courts and from other places to make reforms. So he says that that has no future. I don't think that things can go through Congress. I think we have to open the Pandora box and go through a general constitutional reform. So what's the method to make these transformations? Is there a consensus within your group? I told Crystal in the interview we held with him that the left and the right never talk about this, but I prefer that the Constitution of 1991 in a political setting like the one we have should be just left alone. I feel fearful when you can explode this politically, but I don't know. What have you discussed about these political reforms? And also, Juan Manuel Galan said in the interview that one of the commitments of the coalition has to be institutional. I mean, to enhance the political parties and the institutions of the state. That in a setting, if you have seen the surveys that people are really sad of institutions that the institutions do not meet their needs. So this is that's a political. I mean, what's popular today is to talk terribly about the institutions. That's what people want to say or hear. It's better to break it all and start off new. What's your position? And how is it different to the left, to the right that we've heard in this topic, which is quite abstract and philosophical, but quite important?
Sandra, let me begin with the last part of your question. There's a big consensus. The coalition, undoubtedly, with the conversations I've had with the pre-candidates and the members of the committee, is institutionalist. Indeed, one of the phases that we have discussed is that we want changes, but responsible changes. We don't think that we believe that we have to make public policy changes that go through a right track, but the idea is not to start from scratch. So there's a big difference that we have with Pedro, who says, who not only criticizes everything, uh, it's paradoxical that what he worries about Venezuela is its dependence to oil. He doesn't refer to the dictatorship that a state takes over entirely of power. We believe that the rules of the game are there, so we cannot exceed powers. So there's a huge consensus to have an institutional viewpoint in which we have rules of the game that limit the power of the state. I share with you, Sandra, that we cannot be as a coalition to change entirely the Constitution. And the idea is to discuss this more. I've heard what Cristo said. I said that Humberto Lacalle has also kind of looked at the idea of changing the Constitution, which is weird because in the peace process, we were always against the FARC that wanted to change the Constitution. And we, as the government delegation, no way, we said. This is a transition from the armed conflict to peace. Colombia already made its constitutional transition, but we have to give a body to the agreements. So here we can hear like the way of materializing what's in the Constitution in 1991. But I believe, like you, Sandra, that there's a huge commitment of all the members of the coalition in which they have to give in some cases. We don't have identical people. They've had different positions. But I hope we do that those that want the constitutional reform accept that in this coalition, not to go through that. It's underway still. I'm not saying that this is the final word, but it is possible that we can reach that. I hope we do. When it comes to the political reform, nobody, at least in our committee and in our internal discussions, has talked about the making the overall constitutional reform and a political reform. There are discussions about the contents of the politics to talk about the reform of the electoral national committee, how to transform it to have an independent body that can regulate and follow up the electoral rules. There's a consensus to change the financing system of campaigns by increasing the public financing system. Not everything is public, but significant increase to have prepayment so there's no barrier to access different cases of there's no consensus on closed lists. I defend them. I believe as the electoral study was made, closed list helps to reduce the cost of campaigns, to reduce tension between the members of the same party, no matter what happens in an open election. Everybody becomes really enemies. They hate each other at the end. To have a then closest list would be good. There are others that say otherwise, which is interesting in the sense in which people don't want to vote. The people want to vote more for people that they want to vote and not for a closed list. We think that the parties need more democracy also, and to check the order of that closed list. I understand the counter arguments, but I think that the benefits of closing the list are bigger. I don't think that we will in this coalition not look at these details, but at least there are some elements like the reform of the electoral committee for elections. And the most important is that we can reach consensus that to do it, the process through the ordinary reform of the Constitution, going through Congress, and not to make an overall reform of the Constitution, which would change entirely the system. Juanita, one thing that's interesting for us in the Canadian Council are the attitudes and the role that the new generation would have towards politics. Sandra was with us in a panel that we held with an expert in Chile who also talked about the role of young people. So my question is, to a certain point, is the new generation really responsible for the sins of its parents? Or does it want to move on to another level of politics, substantially or making politics? In your conversations, I mean, you're part of the new generation comparatively. Do you see a new attitude or a desire in any way or a commitment of the young people to make politics differently? And when it comes to interest, that perhaps that or are there any topics that are more interest for the young people? I think Sandra has more to say about this, but I do believe beyond all the tensions created because of the violations of human rights, the protests of November of 2019 and of last year, but especially those of November, showed young people very mobilized. And I deeply believe that there are very important results there. Our big challenge before was that people didn't mobilize. It's in Europe and in the very southern tip of America, it's very common to see manifestations and mobilizations. So the first factor of hope is that the citizens, especially young adults, began to mobilize more. And I had the hypothesis that we have to confirm it, that the peace agreement taking off the FARC and their weaponry created a setting so that the citizens, especially young people, could say, okay, we're going to go out to the streets and demand our rights. So the first part of this optimism is that first, at least the apathy leaped qualitatively to have young adults that were less apathetic, that were worried about the decisions that affected them. Another item, I believe, besides, there were many manifestations of people saying, we don't want you to use us anymore. We don't want people, especially after the plebiscite, at the referendum, people saying, we don't want politicians to get on the platforms. I mean, to not be, people didn't want to be used by political sectors. Then people wanted to have their own agenda. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, it dropped, decreased, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the economic crisis that makes you shift your priorities. And when it comes to Chile, there's also a generation whose parents studied for the first time. Also, there's a slow growth, but steady of improving access to college, the conditions of the healthcare system to reduce poverty that made the last 25 years to have a process that was slow to expand or improve the middle class. So they're young people, young adults who were the first ones in the family that went to college for the first time in their family. But one of the strongest part of the mobilizations was the lack of jobs, the lack of opportunities, which is similar to what we've seen in Chile, where there's this it met the higher middle class, but there are few opportunities for them. So we need more redistribution, creation of jobs, so that these that study more don't don't have um, undignified jobs and cannot meet their aspirations. And lastly, which is fundamental, this generation has a very big environmental awareness. And part of what you heard a lot in the manifestations is that the people saying, hey, from trying to help sharks and whales. I mean, we sit in the most biodiverse country in the world, and we're not taking advantage of this. So there's a different awareness or consciousness about that. There are opportunities, yes. What are the challenges? It's easy for this to disappear. We have to channel this motivation into actions. Why is there so much acceptivism towards politics? I want to help the planet, but I want to get into politics. And to try to motivate young people into politics is very difficult, especially in the rural area, especially because of the lower safety conditions that they have. They say, especially in rural areas, if I get into politics, I get killed. So this mobilization has dropped so much, and that's and we've got leaders that are unmotivated to be participating in politics. And then processes that have been frustrated. We've had this national discussion that Duque has announced as something big, and those that wanted to participate, well, this mobilization is to make changes. They are sacrificed compared to the radical, and they said, look, nothing happened. So this weekend, those that mobilize for action, and many of these leaders, like those student leaders that have been strongly attacked by Petro and are being threatened in the social media because they they did have discussions with the government. There was a big finance for them in the educational sector. Still, those radical sectors see them as as traitors for sitting down with the government. Also, like those in the mobilization of 2019, were seen as traitors and without results at all. So there is optimism because there are citizens mobilized. Risks, I believe that if we don't have the youth politically activated and they want to participate, and if the parties do not attract these young adults, that can just stop there without action. There's a huge challenge that the population cannot have a true impact on the decisions. And that's the big challenge of being effectively participating in politics. Let me leap to something different, Juanita. I know it's a topic that, as the electoral process, it will disappear because it has nothing to do with votes. And it has to do with foreign policy. I believe there that we'll be hearing about this when it comes to Duque's foreign policy. It's been a disaster, and there's a lot that we have to recover when he ends his term, and the recovery process will be long. But I'd like to ask you something specific that you already referred to, and it has to do with Venezuela. I agree that the left at Petro
do not have a discourse that's clear and strong when it comes to Venezuela. We have to clearly condemn what's happening with the law there and propose paths to get out of this, which the right hasn't been able to do it because it only wants to condemn. So there's a lot to do there. But my question is, and if you could tell us the discussions in the coalition on with the treatment of the migrants of Venezuelans and what the mayor of Bogota has been saying about the migration, what's being said within the coalition about them, and what's being thought about our reinsertion internationally as well. Super. I hope that this discussion has a role. But you're right, Sandra. We've done so many things on this and then they get lost. First, I'd like to state all of the members of the coalition, most of the people of the Green Party are against what the mayor of Bogota said when it comes to the Venezuelan migrants. She took the decision of asking for forgiveness and acknowledge that she made two serious mistakes. Personally, I think it doesn't help to talk about the nationality of a criminal, not only because it shows that most of the crimes in Colombia are not made by Venezuelans, but also because the effects of saying things like that about having more xenophobia in Colombia against Venezuela is higher than what the mayor has said. So that's the first thing. There's a clear consensus within the coalition and within the Green Party on this. So with that, and we discussed this with Santa, I am very worried, and I've discussed this with the coalition members, because of the foreign policy of this government. Not only have they continued a process of deinstitutionalize the chancellor's office to appoint people that do not have the merits, that do not have the capabilities, but also there's a lack of strategic vision with regard to the most important aspects to preserve national interests. The typical case is of Venezuela, where we have more importance on the party's vision to see what's at stake for Colombia and how do I reserve. And when it comes to Venezuela, it's obvious that it's for the interest of Colombia to promote a transition towards democracy for that country and to see a stable situation in Venezuela. We couldn't have, we thought that diplomatically, through the diplomatic channels, Maduro would fall, but of course we're far from so. There are different stages of there are different stages in which Colombia could be very intransigent than Trump to promote a way out that would lead to a transitions. We know transitions are complex. You have to pay it, pitch in. We have a government like that of having discussions of legalizing goods. It implies sharing powers for some time so that there's no simply one fall of Chavism, but instead having opposition leaders. None of those alternatives were considered seriously by the Colombian government that has a lot more to lose if Venezuela continues with its dictatorship than to have a transitional
process. So again, we haven't reached that detail in our committee of the coalition. There is a consensus pointing out specifically the depoliticization and the lack of ideology in foreign policy, which is to have a repair, restoring a system that had fallacies, but undoubtedly it has never reached such a poor level with this government. There is also consensus that we have to support a transition towards democracy in Venezuela, and that will go through a negotiation process. So far, those are the consensus. But really, the level where we are of detail right now are just an overall. We haven't discussed anything specific yet. Going to the insertion, this has not been discussed closely in our committee, but when it comes to Colombia, we sent to Duque in Congress a letter in which we acknowledge the migratory decision, but we are concerned because where are the resources and what's the vision on this long term? Because it's great to have the integration. I believe that really is that migrations have the potential of contributing to the well-being of the countries, to economic growth, but that is only if there is a serious process where there's rules, what rights are acquired or gained, and how to meet the rights. And that's very unclear in the Duque government. And we haven't had any answer from our letter in Congress. We think that the words and the headline is fantastic. To have that leadership is good, but it lacks any foundation. It doesn't talk about budget, and that's serious, especially for the municipalities that are so poor that are in the frontier of Venezuela, and they cannot provide the services that are promised. And that can create more xenophobia because it's a promise that creates expectations, and if not met, it creates rejections. So again, for now, and that's part of the challenge, the coalition hasn't reached a detail, but undoubtedly we're convinced that this government has used foreign policy through parties, and definitely we have to stop and have foreign policy that's strategic to preserve national interests. Thank you, Juanita. We don't want to abuse of your time. We already went, we have been with you for over an hour. We have a couple of questions. If you don't mind just answering a question, more than a question, it's really a comment. The gentleman says, it says that the coalition of hope needs the historical pact and vice versa to reach the presidency. And he says, otherwise, the country will have 4 more years of central democratic. What's your opinion, Juanita, in short? I know it's not a short question. It's not a question you can answer in a few words, but still, it's very important. First, I think that this system, now that we have a consensus of making a consultation in March 2020, the same day of the Congress elections, and that's important because the different rounds in which citizens go out and vote allow to add priorities. So there are sectors, I think that the question has to do with that. There are sectors that believe that to win to the right, to win the Uribism, both the coalition and the Hope should get together now and not go to the consultation to choose the candidates for the first round. I understand that not only because Centro Democrático there's like this anxiety, there's like a slogan, we join or we don't, or we die. But what shows us in the analysis of results of 2018, really, and back of the second round of the re-election of Santos, is that there is a sector that's moved by anti-tourism, no matter what's the sector, if it's more to the right, to the left, or to the center, it will vote against tourism. But also, there's a sector that will vote against Petro, and that it really fears Petro. I insist, I fear Petro on topics of being able to deinstitutionalize when he justifies the armed conflict and saying that we were entitled and to justify violence. I mean, not even Timochenko says that. He says we were never entitled to commit crimes. Petro does. So I understand that those fears exist. So under this other vision, what we have to do is to add priorities. And with that sense, to have a first round, to have a unique candidate for the coalition to compete in the first round with the historical pact. And of course, if the coalition of hope goes through the second vote, is to lower the hostility, because I believe that most of the citizens that choose the historical pact, people with whom I am constantly in touch in the region, we talk, I hear their concerns. But these are persons that I undoubtedly think that will arrive here with that second round. So that guarantees that we can defeat the right and Uribism. There are others that say that to get together, and that's better. My fear is that if we get together, there's a central right and center sector that will not vote for Petro. If the formula that we have is one from the first to the second round, we can collect votes from the right and from the central right that will help us to win, which is how Santos won in the second round against Oscar Ivan Zuluaga. Let me end by saying this. We are different alternatives. Here we not only have electoral mechanics, in many topics, we represent different alternatives in the economic aspects on how we believe, for instance, that foreign policy should be made, how to struggle against poverty, how we can have sustainable development in the environment, economy, and social aspects. And the citizens are the ones that have to choose at the first round which of these alternatives will go to the second round, either because ideologically I have a different vision, or because electorally I think that one of these alternatives have more chances to defeat Uribism or the right. But for me, we have different alternatives. We have the left and center left. And in my opinion, we have more chances in the surveys that we've read to have, then we have a better chance than to get together and try to go against Uribe. Thank you so much, Juanita, for your answer and for being with us on hour 10, for being with us. It's been a very interesting. Thank you, Sandra. Of course, Gloria Mejia, also our interpreter, and Martha Blackwell, the organizer of the logistics of these webinars. The recording of this session will be on our website, ccacanada.com, either tonight or tomorrow at the latest. And we'll continue with this series in 2 weeks that we'll be announcing soon. A new politician that will talk with us. So again, thank you so much, Juanita, and good luck. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much for the invitation. and Ms. Brown of what the center means. Bye. Goodbye. Thank you, Sandra. Goodbye.